Okay, gentlemen, this is it. We've come to the final lesson of the year for you guys. It's chapter 32, section 5. Now, just because this is our final lesson and we'll be taking our last quiz on chapter 32 on this Wednesday coming up, it doesn't mean that our work is done. We're going to have a couple of small projects if you're in the regular world history class, and if you're an AP student, you're going to have quite a bit of work on a daily basis getting prepped for the AP exam. Now, I want to thank you guys for staying with all of the process here. I know that I've tried to be as demanding as possible and make sure I hold you guys accountable. I want to finish the year strong, and I think that's really important. You know, we've put in a lot of work. About this time of the year, I usually always cover chapter 32 in a big change-up way. Well, I wasn't able to really do that this year. I usually don't even give a quiz for chapter 32, to be honest with you, because we're usually getting ramped up and starting to review for the final exam. And we also usually play the Civ project. But both of those things have been canceled this year. So all we need to really focus on is this final quiz and then a brief project at the end. I will talk more about, what that project's going to look like. It's going to be really simple. It's just going to be putting in some time on a daily basis to kind of reflect on what you've learned and what were some of your challenges throughout the year. If you're an AP student, you will not have to do that project unless you're not taking the AP test. Okay, gentlemen, so stay tuned for further announcements on those issues. Let's get started at this moment into chapter 32, section 5, which is talking about the aftermath of World War II. Roman numeral 1 says there was a great deal of devastation in Europe. Obviously, we learned in section 4 that the Allies were victorious after 6 years of fighting. World War II caused a lot of death and destruction, really more than any other single event in history. 60 million deaths took place. A third of those deaths were suffered by the Soviet Union. The devastation was fairly remarkable in a bad way. The constant bombing and warfare reduced cities to rubble and destroyed the countryside in Europe. The cities of London, Warsaw, and Berlin, most likely, based on the estimates, suffered the greatest destruction in all of Europe. Now, there is a chart. It's on page 949 right here. And that chart talks about the total amount of money spent by certain countries in the war and the lives lost in war and also civilian lives lost, which is kind of an important chart. So I would suggest in studying for chapter 32 that you take a look at that. Capital letter C is going to talk about other post-war problems. Agricultural problems began. One of the reasons was due to the ravaged countryside where fighting was taking place and the destroyed transportation system, trains, train tracks, bridges, airport runways, things of those nature were definitely targets during World War II to restrict movement. Agricultural products had a rough time getting to markets because of the destroyed transportation systems. Thousands of people actually died after the war due to famine, disease, and the cold and harsh winter because they lacked the proper clothing, shoes, coats, etc. Roman numeral 2 talks about how governments and politics were changing during this scope of post-World War II. Communism was actually on the rise. After the war, many people in Europe, they obviously wanted change. They didn't want to have these type of situations again. People in Germany, Italy, and France especially sought change. These are some of the biggest losers in World War II. France was on the winning side, but of course they suffered great casualties and rubble and cities being destroyed as well. The communism in these countries was on the rise, and membership in that Communist Party began to grow. The communists wanted to seize the moment at the time, and so they began to stage violent strikes which sought political takeover. Now, these strikes actually scared people away from supporting the party because, listen, we just came out of World War II. I don't think people wanted any more fighting, and that was not a very good move by some of those communist regimes. Capital letter B, we'll talk about the Nuremberg trials. You may have heard of these before, but the Nuremberg trials happened during 1945 and 1946. It was an international military tribunal, which means many countries put together key diplomats, judges, lawyers, politicians. They represented 23 nations, and they put Nazi war criminals on trial in Germany. These are Nazi leaders that were charged with committing crimes against humanity. Many Nazi leaders had already committed suicide, but several major officials remained alive, were caught, and were charged. Hermann Göring is one of them. He was the commander of the Luftwaffe, which was the German Air Force. Rudolf Hess was Hitler's former deputy, and there were other big names also charged. Most of these men were found guilty, and they were sentenced to either death or life in prison. Some were hung. You probably should say hanged. I think if you're going off the English version, it should be hanged, executed, and burned at some of the the concentration camps that they had burned victims as well. So there were some pretty harsh punishments for those guys, which probably were well deserved in most cases. Roman numeral 3, post-war Japan was also in ruins. I mean, obviously, you learned about the atomic bombs in Section 4. Japan lay in ruins after World War II. 2 million lives were lost there. Many of the major cities in Japan were destroyed by bombs. The Allies had also taken over all of Japan's colonies in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. And then the United States occupied Japan. Let's talk about what that means. General Douglas MacArthur took control of the United States occupation of Japan. He really wanted to avoid creating further anger that may cause resentment by the Japanese in a future war. But he did have to make some pretty strong moves. One was demilitarization. This was the disbanding or ending of the Japanese armed forces. They really were not allowed to have an army or any navy or air force as well. And also war criminals from Japan were brought to justice. And then there was also the process known as democratization. This is the process of creating a government elected by the people. A new constitution was created for Japan by the United States. It basically turned Japan into a constitutional monarchy, much like Great Britain. This went into effect in 1947. And then we'll talk about some of the changes that occupation by the United States brought to Japan. In the past, the Japanese viewed their emperors as divine, meaning they had the divine right to rule. They were all powerful. Due to the new constitution, though, the emperor now had to declare that he was more or less a figurehead, like those kings and queens and monarchs of Britain. The real power was now in the hands of the people. The country was led by a prime minister, and in 1951, the United States and 47 other nations signed a peace treaty with Japan. Here's a real kicker here. I think this is important. Because Japan was not allowed to have a military, they actually asked the United States to stay in occupation and to use the United States military to protect them. Therefore, the United States and Japan became very good allies, and that alliance is still standing today. I mean, we really have a really good relationship politically with Japan. Guys, that'll do it. Hey, I want to thank you. I'm really sorry that we are not able to be in class together. It is what it is, but I've tried to do my best to give you guys as close of an experience as the classroom environment, as far as our lessons go, as possible. I hope that you have been able to stay with me, and I wish you guys the best here in the upcoming days. Of course, if you need any help with anything, let me know. I look forward to talking to you about a little project that we're going to do. We are going to have a quiz on chapter 32. I'm going to say it's going to be a pretty easy one. I'm probably going to make more of like a 10 to 15 question version here, just because, it's the end of the year. The weather's getting nice. I know you guys want to enjoy that. Don't take it lightly. Some of you guys need a good grade in the grade book here to solidify, some of your grades. But I think that's something that we'll talk about here as we get closer. Thanks, guys.